So today, here I've got my mate Warren, who's on more or less his annual visit to Australia to come and see us. Although this year we caught up twice, once in Britain.
Yes.
So I thought we'd do a video, talk a bit about MMT and maybe the beginnings, what we thought about it, or where we think it's going, but just have a bit of a brief chat, and with Warren in town, what better time to do it. So, Warren, how are you going?
Good.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
We've had bad weather with the bushfires. The air quality's been poor, but it's okay tonight.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, a lot of people have been sending me emails asking me what we were thinking back at the beginning. The beginnings, it's pretty vague because we're not really sure where it began. It began differently for either of us. But what were you thinking at that time?
So, for me, it began when I was in my office, and
you had an office?
there was a possible opportunity with Italian bonds, because Italian bonds were yielding 12%. They all paid in lira, and you could borrow lira at 10% to buy those bonds. So you borrow at 10, you invest at 12, you make 2% for doing nothing. You don't have to put up any money. But if the Italian government defaults, you would lose everything. And so that's why there was a spread. There was a perception that the Italian government would default.
The risk.
Yeah, right. And so,
and of course, at that time, the Italian government had its own currency.
Yes, the lira. And you had an economist named Rudy Dornbush going around, and turns out in front of everywhere I went, but I didn't know at this point in time. But I'd seen the reports from Wall Street and from Dornbush that why Italy would default.
Yeah.
Their debt ratio was high.
All the mainstream economists.
Their interest rates were 12%. Their growth rate was below the interest rate. It was unsustainable.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is unsustainable. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe they are going to default, but if you could come up with a reason they weren't, there was a lot of money to be made. And so we were having conversations in the office. And I was having a conversation just like this with one of my research guys, Tom Schilke, I think his name was. And it just dawned on me. I said, Tom, if we buy securities from the Treasury, or we buy securities from the Fed, central bank, it doesn't make any difference to us. Okay, the money goes to the same place, we own the same thing, there's no difference. I said, and so if there's no difference to us in the private sector, there can't be any functional difference. Any difference is just how they account for it on their side of the ledger, which is just accounting. It's got nothing to do with it. So, it's all the same thing. And so it's either all monetary, when the Fed sells securities, it's to support interest rates, or it's all fiscal. The Treasury sells securities, it's to fund itself. I said, obviously, it's all monetary. It's got nothing to do with it. The whole $3 trillion, that's what the debt was back then. Today, it's 22 or 23. I said, it's just a big reserve trade, and that's the language we used, which means that the reason the government does it, whether they know it or not, is to keep the interest rate from going to zero, to support their policy rate, which at the time was probably 4 or 5%. And that was it. That's why you don't have to worry about governments defaulting, because they're not borrowing to get the money to spend. They've already spent the money. They're spending first, and then they're selling securities to support interest rates.
To mop it up.
And not to fund spending. And they're just shifting the balances from reserve accounts to securities accounts to, again, they're offering interest-bearing accounts to support rates.
Yeah.
So it's all rate support and not funding. So that's all well and good, but if Italy doesn't understand it, they could still make a mistake. Let's say they could still choose to default.
Well, Russia did later.
Yeah, right. And so it's all, any country always has the ability to pay in their own currency, but they might not have the willingness. That's the way the rating agencies say it, ability versus willingness. So we want to make sure they did. So one of our clients was Harvard Management, and Marie Samuels, talked to him immediately about the whole thing. And he said, all right, let's set up a trip to Italy. And he, through the connections of his business card, which was Harvard Management on it, they set up meetings with the treasury in Italy. It was Luigi Spaventa we went to see, and we went through him, and he understood it. So then we had the confidence to know that they knew which buttons to push, to make sure everything operated smoothly. And a week after we left, the finance ministry came out with a statement on no extraordinary measures will be taken, all payments will be made, and the crisis went away. We went to his office. He had on his desk right there Rudy Dornbush's report about default. So, yeah. So anyway, so that's how it started. So then that was back in the Ross Perot days, and where all the deficit hysteria and the whole thing. Yeah. So it's like, all right, this is all a mistake. What can be done about it? Just some kind of social conscience or something to see, get the word out. It's not that hard to understand the government spends first and then collects. And so I went to a meeting. Somehow somebody directed me to a meeting something called Social Policy in New York. And I went up to this meeting, and there were a lot of older people. So I was 45 at the time, something like that. And these people were in their 60s and almost as old as I am now. And there was several women, and there was, I think, maybe one or two men, and they all had suits on, and they were all very self-righteous. They were all the left wing of New York. And I started talking about this, and they're looking at me like I'm crazy, but this is supportive of all their things that they were trying to accomplish. And one of them says to me, he says, there's a group out there you might want to talk to. They call themselves Post-keynesians. So I said, okay, thank you very much. So I went out and looked it up, and then there was an internet discussion group. Somehow it was Post-keynesian, and somehow I got online and started putting these ideas out and getting various responses from people like yourself or Randy Ray or some of the others. And the ones that were, I thought, more receptive and more interested, I started making an effort to go visit. So I came down here, I went to Denver to see Randy, and it turned out I was at a Post-Keynesian conference with Paul Later, Davidson's.
Yeah.
And this guy named Bill Vickery there, and we started talking. He said, oh yeah, that was me, that social policy group that's saying it to the Post-Keynesian group. Yeah. I didn't remember the name at the time. And it was interesting, because he got up to talk, and he was talking about unspent income and how that created a need for deficit spending. They all told him to go sit down. They wouldn't even let him talk. Yeah. Okay. Then as soon as he dies and wins the Nobel Prize, now it's Bill Vickery, and he was one of us and all that. If I hadn't had lunch with the guy, he would have been eating alone, okay?
Yeah, so the early days of PKT, this discussion that was quite interesting.
Yeah.
For me, because living in Australia, it's a long way to get anywhere, and so that really revolutionised communication.
Yeah.
Because when I was a young academic, I used to write letters to people, and 3 months later you'd get the reply back, and so it was really much slower communication. And once that list came on, it was like a revolution for someone like me to come.
So for yourself, you had the buffer stock employment until it became mad cow disease and became job guarantee.
Well, at the time I was doing all the work on inflation.
Inflation, okay.
And job creation and inflation.
Yeah.
And around that time also, if you remember, that Japan had the massive commercial property collapse.
Yeah.
And they had one negative quarter of GDP, and their unemployment rate hardly went up. And so it became also really, that was the start of my Japanese journey. I was talking about in Japan the other day about, they asked me, one of the interviews asked me why I'd become so interested in Japan. Hardly anybody is.
Yeah.
And I said, well, it's because I was, in the early 90s, you had this massive collapse.
Yeah.
But it was hardly a collapse at all.
It's like 90 or 91. Something.
91. And, commercial property, it's the biggest commercial property collapse in history.
Yeah.
Yet they hardly had
ripple and other.
in real terms, and it was because they were using their fiscal policy properly.
Yeah.
And it became real. I became really and they didn't have inflation, so I sort of started to think about all of those things, and that was sort of mindset that I came into that PKT list, and I guess that's why we made a connection.
And the other thing in Australia, which I found out later, first from you and others, is you can talk about deficit spending to support employment or whatever, but first of all, they have all these sustainability issues, but secondly, but what, and this is what I always got, but what you don't understand is that we're a small open economy.
Yeah.
That's what you Americans don't understand.
Yeah.
So there was this thing about because you're a small open economy, you can't support full employment.
Well, I was all, I was still a junior academic at this stage, relatively junior.
Yeah.
And whenever I was designing these job creation schemes on the basis of buffer stocks.
Yeah.
And every time I'd go to a conference, I'd be told, yeah, but we're a small open economy. The
Right.
currency will crash.
Right.
And so that's, I think that was an interesting thing, because you guys are in a relatively closed economy with the, reserve currency for the world. Yeah. And so those two different world cultures, really, currency cultures, were really, I think, has broadened our beginning.
Yeah. So one of the earliest points back when we was talking to Tom was the idea that the currency is a simple monopoly, and so the government is price setter for the price level, and so the source of the price level is prices paid by the government when it spends, or collateral demanded when it lends. And so inflation is always a case of the government paying continuously higher prices for whatever reason. It doesn't have to do that. If it doesn't do that, prices won't go up. It might be bad policy and all kinds of horrible things will happen, but prices won't go up. So when I hear today these MMT proponents saying, well, you don't get inflation until you're overspending, and then you'll know because you're driving up prices. Well, that's not quite it. I mean, it's not wrong, but it's not quite it. What happens is every time the government spends, it makes a choice as to what price it will pay. Yeah. So if it wants to pay whatever, $40,000 for a soldier, fine. But as long as it's paying $40,000 for a soldier, it doesn't matter how many it gets. It's not going to be creating inflation, changing the price level. But as soon as it says, okay, if we want more soldiers, we have to pay $41,000 or something like that. Well, now if it makes that choice to pay the higher price, that's when it's redefined its currency downward. That's when it's, quote, overspent. There might be a lot of excess capacity around or whatever.
Sure, but I mean, what the MMT academics are thinking there is that if you're paying, how much were you paying for your soldier? 40?
Yeah.
40,000?
Whatever,
Yeah, but what happens if soldiers elsewhere are paid 38 and there's not enough soldiers left over to buy? If you're pushing 40, then that's pushing the bid up.
Yeah, you're redefining your currency.
That's what they're saying when we say there's finite real resources and you're pushing up against that barrier. That we're talking the same thing, just in different words.
Right, but the way it's said is that if you overspend, you will get inflation. Like the spending itself is causing.
The way I say it is that it depends upon the bid you're putting into the market.
The bid, yeah. So it's a function of price.
Yeah.
It's the government is defining its currency every time it buys something.
But the bid's not one-dimensional in terms of price. The bid has two dimensions in terms of supply as well.
Well,
if you're pushing up against the real constraint.
Right. But so, for example, let's say you've been hiring soldiers at 38,000, and now to get soldiers you have to pay 40,000. Well, let's say you say no, and you say, well, I'm not going to pay. I'm only going to pay 38. Okay. Now let's say that's the only thing government spends on. So now government spending goes to zero. And so now you've got a massive deflation event. They've got to come to you because the economy needs your money to pay the tax at the end of the day. And so it's different than saying if you overspend, it causes inflation. Because you can't overspend and cause inflation if you don't pay a higher price. right?
Yeah, it's the bid.
Yeah, yeah. So, but that's not the way these other MMT proponents are saying it. And if you read a Bloomberg article quoting any one of them, they'll always say, yes, if you know, if you, as long as you have the excess capacity and things are for sale, you're not causing inflation. Well, it's not wrong, but the point of inflation is when the bid goes up, when the government pays more. And sometimes it's a contracting thing, so it's the offers too. It's not always the bid, but in market terms, there's a bid and offer. But it's when the actual price paid by government is the defining point of the value of the currency. The other interesting thing is, I went through this with Andrea Terzi because we were trying to kind of unify things. If the government's lending, if it lent money unsecured, you know, to anybody who wanted to borrow, then there'd be no value to the currency either, right? And so it's collateral demanded when you lend. But more to the point, when you lend, you're buying the other person's signed note. And so that kind of unifies lending and spending. All right, so if you buy a house, you borrow $100,000. What does the bank do? You sign a note for $100,000. They buy it for $100,000. So it's a purchase. So it's an asset purchase, right? And so, which then is, you know, you then take the $100,000 and buy the house. Okay, and so I know when I say spending or lending, which I did for a long time, it's actually redundant because lending is spending.
Yeah.
Carefully, you know, in close examination. So,
Which reminds me of this. You know, let's just think about this YouTube little debate you had in Italy the other day.
Oh.
I got heaps of emails about it. That's why I want to really clear this up.
Yeah.
And the issue was that you were talking a matter of logic.
Yeah.
And then the Italian guy thought he had the killer move,
Yeah.
and disputed the semantics in a way.
Yeah.
Now, you know I didn't think it was a good idea withdrawing from the debate. I don't think that adds to the thing.
Yeah, it wasn't a conscious choice to withdraw.
Yeah, no, I know that, but
Okay.
I mean the point is
I got pushed out. Yeah.
the point is that depending on what audience and what level they're at in terms of getting used to the terminology and the ideas, a simple heuristic like you can't pay taxes until the government spent the currency is useful. Now, as an academic, what our role is then is to add layers of institutional reality and complexity. And I'm talking here about loans and spending.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's an easy point to say when you've got a complex institutional structure that, oh, it's obvious, you can go to his point was, oh, you're wrong because you can go to the bank and borrow some money
So hold up right
to
there.
pay your taxes.
So he said that, then I wanted to respond to that.
Yeah.
He says, no, you have to let me finish.
Yeah.
And then he goes on like 5 different things. And then I couldn't even remember what he said at the beginning after that.
Yeah, the point is though that simple, in a complex world, it's quite clear you can go to the bank and borrow money to pay your taxes.
Sure.
But the simple heuristic that we start off with, spending the currency into existence, then has to morph to reflect the institutional reality.
Yeah, well, you respond to questions.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the institutional reality then gets more complicated, and so at the end of that, you wanted to say, oh, well, the banks are agents of the government.
Yeah, which I did. I did remember that and bring it back, and then he starts explaining why they're not, and then 5 more things. And then he threw up some straw man about, you know, when you said this and this, something I hadn't said. And I said, okay, I can't deal with him not only throwing these compounded things, but then throwing one straw man after another.
Yeah, I think
and said, this is not, you know.
To resolve, I mean, I've had a lot of emails about it. People are saying, what the hell's going on? And the way I've resolved it, I hope for people, is to say, look, in a simple level, spending into existence. But when you say add some institutions...
What are we resolving?
Well, what people say in these emails to me is, this Italian guy proved that you don't need to spend the currency into existence to pay the taxes.
Oh,
And
yeah, no, well, he didn't at all, but
but the point is that you can go to the bank and borrow and pay your taxes. But the complexity then goes in
yeah,
and say, well, those banks can't create the reserves to clear those loans.
well, okay, so number one, the banks are agents of the government, in the US at least, okay?
Well,
And this-
they're agents because they're licensed,
yeah.
but they're not agents in the sense that they're doing the government's job.
Yes, they are. They're being paid to do the government's job. Not everything they do, but in this case, the government is contracted them to do this job,
Licensed them.
licensed them to do this job.
Yeah.
So they're acting, as agents of the government,
Yes.
under the common definition of the word agent. That
Well,
they're-
yeah, but I mean, other people say no. Randy, for example, says no. They're profit-seeking banks.
Sure, but most agents are profit-seeking. If you have a real estate agent, they're profit-seeking, but they're your agent, and they're contracted to
Sure.
do your bidding.
Sure.
You've got an insurance agent, he's profit-seeking.
But don't you think the important point that is that ultimately it's the government that's got to make the
Yeah.
reserves.
It's government or it's agents. It can assign an agent.
Yeah. But
assign that job to
But
an
in this
agent.
case, the agent can't create the reserves that clear the payment system.
They can, in the sense that the government has allowed them, as part of the license agreement,
Yeah.
to run an overdraft in their account at the Fed. And an overdraft is a loan. So
Sure,
they-
but
so they've been-
it's a loan from the government.
Yeah, so they've been, they've been pre-approved.
Sure,
To run
but see, that's
So that makes them, that's what the agent's done. They
that's
can
the
act-
nuance of the
Right,
complexity.
but if you're pre-approved and given a credit line, it's like they've been given a credit line.
Sure.
So now they're acting, they've got a credit line that came from the government, and they're acting
Sure.
as an agent for the government, using the credit line assigned to them by the government.
No problem, but that's the complexity once you add the
Sure,
institutional
sure.
structure, and that's what that guy missed.
Oh, well, he missed more than that.
Yeah, but we're just
Yeah.
talking about that loan spending bit.
Okay, so number one, he missed the idea that I said the government or its agents has to spend first. So in this case, it's the agent, the bank, that's spending and buying your signed note.
Sure.
So and they're doing it on behalf of the government, who's given them a credit line to facilitate the
Yeah.
payment of taxes. And the credit line is good for pretty much an unlimited amount. The government is,
Well, otherwise you don't have financial stability, so.
yeah, the government has given banks a capital requirement to protect themselves, so to speak.
Yeah.
And they're taking a chance, and every once in a while they lose. Yeah, and you can have a real estate agent who oversteps his bounds and you lose, or an insurance agent or anybody else. So agents, look, soldiers are agents of the government, right? And they make mistakes and shoot the wrong people and do all kinds of things.
So just moving on, because we don't want this to go all day, this
Yeah.
video.
Well,
But,
I think it's important because
I do too.
if you're going to engage with somebody like that professor, you have to be able to do it in an immediate back and forth.
Yeah.
If you just let them run on for 3 to 5 minutes about everything and then have to come back to the first thing,
Yeah.
you're just...
I mean, the point about that is
it's
that
not possible. Yeah.
you've got to, I exert a great deal of control over every interaction I have.
Right.
Just moving on, the last thing I thought we might think about was at the MMT conference in New York recently, I heard a lot of stuff, and I said, well, what I think this all amounts to is we've got post-MMT, and it was sort of a polite way of that I see this core body of knowledge that more or less has been developed by the team with different inputs and different motivations, and that's the fact. And that's what we now, I think, call MMT. And now there's all this other stuff that I'm going to call post-MMT because it's sort of not MMT.
Yeah.
Are you feeling the same way?
Yeah. So what I wanted to do was attempt to answer the question of what is MMT. And so, going back to the beginning, I think the largest contribution of MMT is the idea that the government spends first before it collects taxes. And the reason is because everyone believes the opposite. So if you go to any member of parliament, anybody in Congress, they know that they have to collect money from taxes to be able to spend. And what they don't collect in taxes, they have to borrow from China or whatever, and then leave that debt to our children someday.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's is the core error in thinking in the legislatures throughout the world. And that's what's keeping other policy options off the table, such as your job guarantee originally when you came up with it. That's what was keeping it from doing it. Because my thoughts originally were if they understood that they've got that backwards, that they're actually spending first and collecting it. You know, it's like the movie theater. They don't collect the ticket first and then sell it, or the sports stadium. They don't collect the ticket first and then sell it. They all know it's the other way around. If they had that backwards, sports and movie theaters would never run properly, right?
Well,
So to me, the core contribution is at that practical level, and that alone is what's in the way of having more policy options on the table.
Yeah, I mean, what I think the body of knowledge delivers is that the policy space is much different to what we believe.
Yeah, and that's the core reason. I think that's the first reason. That's the beginning of MMT, is the sequence is backwards. And there are other things that are derived from that you have a monopoly, that you're price setter, and inflation comes from these things. You know, there's a lot of other contributions, but they all start with this core idea that everybody's got this one thing backwards, and we've got it right way around. And so I wanted to get that across as, what is MMT? So when Bloomberg or Forbes writes an article on what is, they say, well, what is MMT? And they say, oh, that's when the central bank monetizes the treasury. So it says, no. It's the core understanding that everybody's got this backwards, that the government has to get money to spend, when actually they have to spend first to be able to, for taxes to be paid. Now, unfortunately, that's got turned around, or got turned into a very ambiguous statement that taxes don't fund spending. So it depends on how you define the word fund, right? Spending is not constrained by revenues. You don't need the money from taxes to be able to spend, but fund can be a much broader term than that.
Well, see, I remember back at the early days of the PKT list.
Yeah.
Steve Keen actually raised this with me.
Yeah.
And by the way, I wrote to Rick Holt, if you remember, he was the convener.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I've asked him if he's got all of the
archives. Yeah.
And he sent me an email today that they were transferred from Colorado to Roosevelt University, which is in Chicago, I believe. And Roosevelt University had a massive computer crash, and all the archives were lost. But I've got another lead. But I remember Steve Keen raised this issue. He said, it's just semantic about funding.
Yeah.
Because they're still funding the government spending.
Right.
And I said, well, the only way you could conceive of them funding is in terms of freeing up the real resource space.
Well, okay, and so I say that the way I say it is, yes, spending comes first, but before taxes are paid, but tax liabilities come before spending. Because you've got to create the sellers. You've got to create a need for the sellers of the currency first. So that's why we have the money story, which is different from everybody else's money story. People start with barter or whatever, and I'm not arguing about it. Might be, who cares? But right now, for state currency like the dollar or the yen, which is what we're concerned about policy today, the money story starts with the tax liability. That creates sellers of goods and services, sellers of labor we call unemployed. So let's say it creates unemployment, which wouldn't exist without tax liabilities. For the further purpose of the government then can spend its otherwise worthless currency, and then
do stuff,
and then taxes get paid. So there's a sequence. So tax liabilities come first and they drive the system. That renders, and that means that the currency itself is the tax credit.
Yeah.
Okay, so the dollar is just a tax credit. The yen's a tax
I think most people are saying that these days.
Right, but they're not putting it first. Number one, the MMT is about the idea that the sequence is backwards. And here's the actual sequence as explained by MMT, which is our money story. When you and if we start with that and point out that that is what distinguishes us from A, so it's one of the main distinctions between us and the other schools of thought, which never went there. I mean, you never had Keynes talking about the government spends first and then collects.
No.
Okay, so you never had this in there. It's not in any mainstream model. Okay, it's not in any new Keynesian model. It's not, they didn't have money in there, but it's not in any of their models, right? But once you do that, it transforms everything. So to me, that's the starting point. So I came up with this idea, okay, well, I'll come up with this white paper, for lack of a better idea, that to get this starting point where it is and to show the main distinction between MMT and other schools of thought and why it can properly be considered its own school of thought because of this alone. Because once you have a different starting point, everything else follows in a different way, right, with all kinds of connotations and policy options. And it's never gotten anywhere. You know, and I look back, it started back in February of last year. And so when you talk about MMT, what did you call it?
Post-MMT.
Post-MMT.
It's a post-Keynesian little joke.
Yeah, what's happened is they've lost the notion of this sequence being where it all starts.
Well, see, one of the problems...
Along with other things.
One of the problems, I think, and I've written about this and I've said it at MMT conferences, is that in particular jurisdictions, and let's say America in this case, the body of work has become sort of tied up with political consideration.
Yeah.
And once you start doing that, then and you're expressing it as a particular political agenda, then there's all sorts of compromises start slipping in.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by post-MMT. All these
yeah.
compromises are nothing to do with the core body of work.
Right, right.
Because the core body of work is seen by various people as being politically not salable, or I don't know, their motivation.
Yeah.
And so you start getting statements that are attributed to MMT that aren't core, they're political compromises.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I meant by post-MMT.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a problem.
Let me say something about the Green New Deal. You know, the first thing you have to determine is this a positive or a negative productivity shock, right? Because if it's a negative productivity shock, it doesn't mean we can't afford to pay for it. It means we're going to see a drop in how we have defined the standard of living. In other sense, it may go up, but the way we've defined it in terms of consumption and material.
In the current culture, it's...
Yeah. So, if it's a positive productivity shock, fine. But if it's not, there's a pretty severe real cost to this whole thing. And a lot of MMT proponents have been unrealistic about that. It's like, oh, we're going to create millions of new jobs. Well, jobs are a cost. They're an input. They're not a benefit. And so somehow this has gotten translated into a good thing. You know, oh, if we outlaw lawnmowers and we all cut the lawns with scissors, we're going to have all these new jobs. We'll all be better off.
Well,
you know? It's like negative productivity shock is a negative productivity shock.
And the thing the thing that they're saying, the thing that's been getting to me is that the job component of the massive transformation that we're going to have to make if we're going to deal with these emergencies is being expressed as a job guarantee.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm going to talk in Sydney tomorrow, that the job guarantee is a small part of it.
Yeah.
It's a little buffer stock, typically meant to be very small.
Yeah.
What we're going to need is massive reskilling of people, high-skilled people.
So as a purist, MMT purist, I'll call myself, apolitical. But, if there is a need for public service jobs, just hire them in a normal way.
Yeah, and they're going to be high-skilled by the nature of the sort of challenge.
Yeah.
They're going to be high-skilled, very highly educated people.
Yeah, and even if they're low-skilled, you just hire them. Even if they're no skilled, if you want them to work in the public sector, just hire them as full-time public sector. I have no problem with that. If you
I
want
mean,
people,
one of the things of this post-MMT is that they're, and I've written it in this way, that you don't want to make the job guarantee to do too much. You can't, it's not a solution to everything.
yeah, well, I see it as after you've gotten everybody you want in the public sector, you've hired people to do surfing part-time on the beach, fine. I don't have any problem with any of that as long as that's generally considered, to further public purpose. You've got people holding hands in the old age homes. You've got, okay, so once you've used everybody you want, once the public sector is at the right size, now whatever's left, you want to transition them back to the private sector where they came from. Because back to the money story, there was nobody in the public sector in the beginning of the money story, okay? Everybody was in the private sector doing something in a non-monetary society. The tax extracted them into the public sector. Once you're unemployed, you're out of the private sector, so therefore you're in only two sectors. You're in the public sector. The public sector hired as many as the unemployed it wanted. It made a mistake. The tax created more unemployed than it wanted. Fine. Work to transition them back, so they'll be useful and productive. If you say, well, they can do things in the public sector, fine, just go hire them. I don't have any problem with that at all. And if it means you hire every last one of them, good, into regular public sector jobs. But the job guarantee is the buffer stock, which is used to transition them back to provide a superior price anchor than using unemployment as a way to transition them back. Today we use unemployment to transition people back. It's the worst possible way to do it.
Yeah, no, we agree on that.
Well, a lot of they'll see an article and they'll say, well, what are the job guarantees going to, there's lots of things they can do. It's like, wrong answer. Yeah. They're going to transition back into the private sector or we failed. And that, then you get on to the next question. Nobody pushes back on that. And then it can happen. But no, they come up with all these things they can do. It's like, just hire people to do that. There isn't one thing they've said that they could do other than transition that I would have said, just hire them. Well, they're only part-time, they're not cyclical, just hire them, so what?
Yeah, sure.
What's the difference? And plus, the problem is, when you're giving them things to do that I see as rightly public sector jobs, you're undermining a hard-earned public sector structure of compensation. And suddenly, people would be making 60, 80, 100,000 US, in Australia more, in the public sector. Well, now you've got, $15,000 a year, $20,000, $30,000 a year job guarantee people. And they say, well, we didn't replace anybody. Well, so what? You added new people. It's the same thing. And there's going to be, there already is, a backlash from, what you call a left, who have had a long struggle to get public sector compensation at reasonable levels.
Well, it's the left that are giving the most grief at the moment. So.
Yeah, and rightly so, because the answers are given. I give grief also.
I don't know about that. That's another topic. Anyway, 25 years later, we've had
I finally reached retirement age. I'm 70.
I haven't retired yet. I've still got this.
I've got Medicare. I'm on Social Security.
I've got this MMT ed thing that I want to get together, and
yeah, you're still on.
That's what I'll be doing. Anyway, we've probably spoken too long for this video, but
okay,
okay, take care.